All right. Well, it is the top of the hour, and I know we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon to everyone who's here. Thanks so much for joining us again. Quick reminder that this program is being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel probably later today. So accordingly, as you've noticed, you are muted and your video is off, and that's really to avoid any distractions during the recording. So please open up your chat if you haven't already. We'll use that to engage, and it's also a place where you can pose questions, and I'll kind of keep track of those for you, Rachana.
Yeah.
Also, a reminder that today's Lunch and Learn is going to go until 12:45, which is a little bit later instead of 12:30. So if you need to leave at 12:30, no problem. Be sure to watch for the follow-up email, and that will include a link to the recording. And Dr. Bhave has also been gracious to say she'll stay on a little bit after to leave more time for discussion for those who do want to stay on for a few minutes after 12:45, so we can offer you that as well. So with that, I know we've got a lot to cover. So without further ado, let me do a quick intro and we'll get started. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rachana Bhave. I hope I'm saying that okay. Our equitable assessment specialist at the Center for Teaching and Learning. Rachana earned her PhD in biology from the University of Virginia, and she's passionate about creating equitable interdisciplinary learning environments. With her extensive background in teaching, assessment design, and promoting diversity and inclusion, she brings a wealth of knowledge to her role here at CU Boulder. Today, she'll be guiding us through disarming the gut punch through relating, bridging intent and impact, where we're going to learn a framework for individuals, yourselves, to address behaviors without negating the impact they might have. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachana Bhave.
Thank you so much, Liz, and I appreciate the Ombuds Office for extending this invitation. What I'm going to do is kind of a part two to our first presentation where we discussed when experiencing a microaggressions, what are things to consider in order to address it. And today we'll be discussing kind of the other side of the story, right? What if someone tells you that, or you're confronted that you you've conducted a microaggression or came across as being microaggressive? How does one react in a way that doesn't extend that harm further, but work towards resolving and working towards progression, towards better behavior? I must mention that, as Liz mentioned, my background is as a biologist and as an assessment specialist. So this presentation is really the work and scholarship of my colleague, Dr. Cortez Scott, who previously worked as the CTL Inclusive Pedagogy Lead and is currently the Assistant Dean of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity in Agriculture at the Colorado State University. And he's been gracious enough to guide me through a lot of the readings and the framework in which to think about these topics. So it's really, I'm the kind of the voiceover for his presentation in a way. And I really appreciate that and want to acknowledge that, and hope that that information is relevant for all of you present here. There will be some repetitive information in the first couple of slides that I'll kind of go over fairly quickly. I do want to mention certain learning agreements as we navigate this issue. I just invite you all to be open and honest with yourselves as you're reflecting on past experiences or behaviors you might have observed. Authenticity really promotes experiential learning. I invite you, if at any point you want to share personal experiences, to use I or we statements without maybe explicitly recognizing particular departments, courses, or names of people without naming them, but just acknowledging your personal relationship to them. Ideally, we do not want to aim harm. And also for those who have felt harmed by any statement made, please do trust the intent that the person is coming from an unintentionally good place or is not causing intentional harm, but feel empowered to name impact. I already mentioned this. And at the end, if anyone does mention an incident, please avoid probing for information that is not shared. So don't try to figure out, oh, what department this is, or where did this happen, and leave it up to the person to share as much as they are comfortable with. I recognize that we are a very large group and we have a very short amount of time together, about 25 minutes to 35 minutes together. And so I do want to note that a lot of these interactions are likely to take place in chat. So please consider using language well, but also consider enjoying this short amount of space and time together. I might not be able to monitor all the chat, but know that I'm saving it and reading all the comments and reviewing it. So if at any point there are questions that come up that I'm unable to address, please put them in the chat. As we proceed with the content, though, I invite you all in the chat to please type your name, preferred pronouns, your role, or which department or unit you're joining us from, and maybe just your go-to fun activity in the winter. Mine is very obvious. I love cozying up to a book or candle, some good coffee by the window, and just reading a book. But feel free to put it in the chat. And if you're comfortable, also add what you're looking to get out of this presentation. So I'll give you all a minute to put that in the chat just to get to know who the audience is. And then I'll proceed with some kind of quick recap of microaggressions, and we'll go into the main content of today's presentation. And this is also an exercise of the word relating, right? Finding relationships, finding commonalities with each other, so that if at any point there are heated discussions, we remember the person for who they are. And thank you so much. I'm enjoying reading all this. And this is kind of a selfish activity because I'm always looking for friends to hang out with. So I hope I can make some connections this way. All right, please continue putting in the chats while I recap a little bit about what we learned in the last session about microaggressions. So quick definition about microaggressions. These are defined as snubs, slights, or insults directed towards historically marginalized people that implicitly communicate stereotypical ideas or engender hostility towards people belonging to those communities. And so those snubs or slights or insults may come across as really innocuous comments, but because of the historicity associated with stereotypes for that community, they can really cause major harm in terms of kind of promoting uncertainty, belonging uncertainty, as well as negative stereotype threat. There are several types of microaggressions, and I just wanted to quickly go over them again. We discussed microassaults, which are forms of prejudice or stereotyping and discrimination that is fairly overt and intentional, hurtful, but they're still not like physical assaults. They're often mental assaults that are often these throwaway statements that are made, like saying a slur and or displaying a racist symbol, or even saying a joke that is stereotypical and derogatory, but then passing it off as being a joke. Micro insults are often subtle messages of rudeness or insensitivity regarding the person's identity. Micro invalidations are remarks and actions, whether spoken or unspoken, that invalidate the ideas or lived experience of an individual or a group. So to say something like, oh, X community is just being too sensitive or too woke when they say these things. So you're invalidating their lived experience. Microaggressions, more evolved definition, also define it as outright abuse, right? Because it draws attention to how those actions cause distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety amongst people belonging to those marginalized communities. And as we had mentioned last time, regardless of what we call them, right? Whatever we call them, microaggressions, microassaults, abuse, trauma, they can really, or types of abuse, they all have really lasting effects of trauma. And so just because the word micro doesn't mean that the impact of it isn't large. I invite you all to just look at this image on the screen for a minute and tell me what you notice in this image. What does it evoke for you? It could be a more personal experience, but it could also be something, if you not experience those comments, what does it tell you? What does this image tell you? And if you haven't done so already, I invite you to also put some comments in the chat in response to this prompt. So someone mentions how each time the load gets heavier. Someone asked why the definition of microaggressions is only applicable to marginalized groups. So I do want to mention here that forms of microaggressions are often forms of systemic discrimination, right? So if somebody belonging to a dominant community or dominant group that is experiencing power in the system is making a statement that invalidates the perception or belonging or sense of belonging of that other person, those types of statements in and of itself can be discriminatory, even if it's vice versa, right? Say a privileged white male is told something that is probably demeaning or makes a stereotype about them, it is still a statement that might be perceived as being harmful, but it's not considered systemic because even in that moment, the person of that certain dominant identity is experiencing privilege in a systematic way that does not that statement does not perpetuate the same degree of harm as it would to marginalized identities. That does not mean that harmful statements are not made against other groups, or it works both ways. But when we're talking about microaggressions, we're really talking about how those statements are made in a way that is stereotyping a community. And if that stereotyping is against a marginalized community in a way that even an innocuous statement is attaching certain beliefs that are treated as insults towards members of that community. I hope that clarifies a bit of that. A lot of you mentioned like how, the load is continuing, the character is still smiling despite carrying that load, and how the buildup of microaggressions can weigh down over time, right? And you can see a lot of these statements are really questioning the authority of a person belonging to that community and is sending the message that they do not belong there, or that they are in a space where they do not belong. Now, thank you all for those comments. Feel free to keep putting that in the chat. Now, in the first part, when we discuss addressing microaggressions, we discuss strategies on how to address those microaggressions when being on the receiving end. And I want to remind everyone that it is not easy for anyone to do that because microaggressions can be notoriously hard to detect and address in the moment because they're often just conversational and happens in an offhand conversation. Microaggressions can also be very commonplace. So if the person is repeatedly receiving messages that they do not belong through those different statements, it can be hard for them to address like one or the other, and they may just feel exhausted to even address it because they experience it so often. And finally, the person may not experience a safe environment in which to address these invalidating comments. Now, given that, imagine when a person experiencing a microaggression then goes up to someone, is courageous enough to say, hey, I think this was harmful, or this is how it made me feel, to then be met with statements like, oh, but that was not their intent, they are a nice person, or to say, I'm sorry if I made you feel that way, or to hear that, oh, I would never say that, I'm not X, I'm not sexist, I'm not ageist, I'm not racist. Of course, nobody wants to be call those things. And that's not what they're saying, but those are the reactions that they're often met with. Now, I invite you in the chat, if you've ever experienced such statements, to maybe articulate how did it make you feel to hear those statements, right? And I bet you in a lot of cases, the person feels shut down, they feel further invalidated. Oftentimes, these statements are forms of additional microaggressions or harm extended to the person who's already in another scenario has experienced harm that they're bringing up in this situation, right? And so if anyone has comments on, how these statements may make them feel, or if they haven't experienced this, just considering from that point of view of that person, how does it make one feel? Julie very rightly says, feels invalidating, right? It can totally feel invalidating and confusing. You start questioning for yourself, did I make a mistake? Am I just being gaslit? Am I just dreaming that I experienced a microaggression? It can be very frustrating for that person to constantly have to prove that their experience is valid, apart from all the other things that microaggressions can do. Thank you so much for sharing that, everyone. Insulted, angry, it can make you feel weak. And then you're spent distracted the whole time thinking about if one should address it or not, right? So really, this presentation is to invite us all to consider doing better and not making those statements. But let's step back a little on why we would make those statements, or why do we feel so compelled to defend ourselves in those moments, right? Even though what the person is saying is that that particular statement was sexist or ageist, they're not accusing a person to be sexist or ageist. And so there is a difference in that too. And so to keep in mind, or to give you a sense of why we often feel that way, I found this quote to be very illuminating. It's by Michelle Myung Kim, and all of these links in the particular presentation will take you to e-copies of the book that are available through the Nordland Library. So please consider exploring it for further reading, right? So part of our obsession with wanting to be seen as a good person is that it fuels our binary thinking, right? If we are not good, or if we haven't done a good thing, then it must mean we are bad, and vice versa. And nobody likes feeling that they are a bad person. We all, in a lot of times, microaggressions are extended by people who are actually fairly well-meaning, and don't even realize they're making that mistake, right? And it is not to say that they're being intentional. Oftentimes, these statements are made out of implicit biases, which we had previously in the last session discussed how those are part of mental conditioning of perceptions across social identities, right? And oftentimes we're picking up on this information based on like majority view, which may or may not be right at the time. And oftentimes the longer one is exposed to this type of information, the longer it is stored in our mind, and it's likely to be activated in a way that we don't even realize we're making these mistakes. And so we can trace a lot of our attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, perceptions to these implicit biases, right? So it's not really a personal fault as such. It is oftentimes an outcome of our conditioning and the privilege with which we live with, but also systemic conditioning. And therefore, I think this is also a silver lining in that although everyone may have biases, it does not mean that it's okay to make microaggressive statements. But because these are biases and not fixed, immutable characteristics, it's important to know that these biases can change, that we can do better to think differently and therefore to speak differently, right? And so in the next half of this presentation, I'm going to discuss a little bit more about how do you address microaggressions when confronted with it. And oftentimes these are done through relationships and understanding how our concepts of self work, as well as then using the RELATE as an acronym to remember ways to react when someone is confronted with a microaggression. So I'm briefly going to talk about these two theories of self-awareness and self-verification. And I hope it'll make sense as to why we often hear these statements of saying that, oh, we're not sexist or racist or being defensive. Why do those statements come up so often, right? Now, this really has to do with the way we see ourselves, right? Our internal point of view says that allows us to determine what our values are, what our behaviors are, and what impact we have. But we also have an understanding of how others perceive us, right? That is also part of self-awareness. And oftentimes we make judgments on whether these interactions are going to go well or not, depending on what we think others are perceiving us as. And therefore, with self-awareness, it's really important to have kind of a reflexive point of view, right? To be able to view oneself objectively and say, okay, no, these are our behaviors or actions. And so this is the type of person we are, and to be able to think of ourselves more objectively. However, it's important to note that we're not always very consciously reflexive, right? We often tend to bin our ideas of self as being these binaries of good or bad people. However, this can often come in the way of critical self-reflection, and it can come in the way of identifying when our actions fall short of our ideas of self, right? We can't truly understand our actions well if we do not give critical attention to not only our own behaviors, but how others perceive us. Understand, what are these motivations of behavior? Like we said, a lot of times the statements are microaggressive because they're originating from implicit biases. And so we may not think that way, or we may not intend to work a certain way, but we've nonetheless caused harmful impact through our behaviors. And then finally, if we're not critically self-aware, it comes in the way of acknowledging the impact we've had on others, right? Because we're so worried about maintaining that sense of self as being a good person. And this feeds into the idea of self-verification as well. So self-verification is a theory where once we've formed a self-view, we tend to interact with individuals who can either confirm that self-view for us, and that kind of creates this sense of coherence and continuity. And self-views could be positive or negative, but they're formed by our social environment and the way we view ourselves. And that often is also a reason why when we, once we've maintained a kind of self-view, it's really hard for us to change and to realize that, oh, somebody made a statement that's kind of against my idea of a person who's good, right? And so oftentimes folks will fight to maintain that self-view through corroborating evidence and can shut down. And so it's really important to note that as a result of these two ideas of self, we often fall into these traps when confronted or being informed that we've committed a microaggressions. And this, a lot of folks in the chat will identify, right? Once they've said to someone, hey, this was a statement that made me feel bad, oftentimes a behavior they experience is that the person is now dodging all types of conversation, right? They either excuse themselves or go completely silent and then completely not share their genuine opinions. And in a way, they're just avoiding matters of the conversation completely. On the other hand, sometimes folks may end up deflecting the conversation, right? So they either leave the conversation or they'll shift it to something completely different, to say something like, oh, I don't like the tone in which you're speaking to me, or I'm finding it difficult to be in this moment because of how you are talking to me, or how you said this wrong thing that I potentially did. In other cases, folks can channel switch. So in a way, they might just expand that issue to mean something more broader, which is not the focus of the conversation, right? So to say something when someone says Black Lives Matter, to then say all lives matter is a form of upswitching, where you're now saying, yes, it's not that all lives don't matter, all lives do matter, but in that moment, someone is emphasizing how Black lives are often devalued and that they matter, and they're making a statement in that regard. On the other hand, down switching will be to make something very narrow, right? When somebody is talking about racial issues, to then say, oh, but this is not really a race thing, but this is more of a gender thing. It's a specific gender thing and not a race thing, or not an age thing, and so on. Or redirect attention to say, oh, but we've been doing so well in this regard. Why are we focusing on the negative things? These are all forms of deflection, which at the end of the day mean that the person who's experienced a microaggression has not received a resolution, has not received an apology for that behavior. And instead, the conversation has devolved into something completely different from the issue at hand. Another aspect can be denial, right? To say outwardly, to reject the issue or concern that, oh, this is not how I meant it, or focusing on feelings over facts. So to say something like, oh, I'm sorry I made you feel that way, is kind of microaggressive, because you're not focusing on the fact that you committed the behavior, but that the harm feelings is brought to attention. And so you're apologizing just because you made the person feel a certain way, but not apologizing for your direct actions. On the other hand, denial might come across as minimizing the extent of harm done, or having a closed mindset. And sometimes it can also devolve to outright attacks, right? It can become combative, where you're then challenging the person's behavior or belief, saying that, oh, you don't understand what you're saying, or you're calling into integrity and intelligence, calling into question one's integrity and intelligence. And note that all these types of behaviors is what makes it really hard for a person to also decide to confront someone with a microaggression, because they so often experience these types of deflections from the other person. And know that these are all ways to maintain that self-view and self-verification. This book by Yoshino and Glasgow is another great read. So I've linked that here. Please go through it, right? And so this is not to blame anyone. And I know that these are hard to confront, right? So it takes some time and effort in order to overcome these types of progress traps. And so that's where self-compassion comes in, to recognize that and see someone suffering, feel kindness, and acknowledge that we are going to make mistakes, right? And so this is a place where parties on both sides need to have compassion in order to have that conversation, right? So it doesn't mean that if someone has told us that we have committed a microaggression, that we devolve into self-hatred. Rather, self-compassion allows us to then foster a positive mindset, acknowledge that the problem that we're facing is worth being tended to, and also remember that to make mistakes is human, right? Oftentimes, in order to avoid making mistakes, we completely avoid conversation and interactions with people, which can also come across as a microaggressive behavior. And we're not really progressing, we're not really improving our self-view, or we're missing out on the rich community we can experience with others. And so that's where the relate framework comes when confronted, right? And use these acronyms as ways to remember to react, and how to bridge that intent and impact is to, first of all, recognize that we're not the focus of the conversation, right? When someone comes up to us to say that we've experienced a microaggression, remember that the person experiencing the microaggression is the focus of the conversation, not us, right? Empathize as a listener. So let them speak fully and freely and be heard for what they've experienced, why they feel that way, etc., without interrupting them or questioning their emotions or questioning how they're feeling or thinking, etc. And then acknowledge, accept, and apologize, right? And apologize without conditions, saying, I am sorry for having said that, or I am sorry for making that statement, I'm sorry for assuming this, etc., etc. And make those apologies without conditions, without trying to justify that action, because again, those can be progress traps. But then take time to reflect and then engage in critical action. So really remember this relate framework. The other piece I wanted to quickly mention is, as a bystander who's watching this going on, we often are also in a situation where we can intervene a potentially harmful situation. Of course, it can be tricky to identify that potentially harmful situation, right? However, being an active bystander means that we're allowing our beliefs and values to encourage us to act in this particular situation, which might be seen as unjust. And so I just wanted to quickly highlight the 4 Ds of active bystander training, which also play an important role when we are considering microaggressions taking place, right? Of course, somebody previously had pointed to me that sometimes intervening without the permission of the person experiencing a microaggression can also feel invalidating. So I think that in that place, you have to be careful to pay attention to cues from the other person. Are they uncomfortable in that situation? And first ask if they need intervention, right? Do not intervene without their permission. Having said that, there are some ways to do it without, invalidating that person's experience. So the first D often in active bystander intervention is to distract, to take attention away from the topic of conversation. So to, in the moment, change the topic of conversation or point to something unrelated. The second thing could be to delegate, right? So if you don't feel comfortable intervening, you can get another person who may be better equipped to deal with the situation to intervene. In other places, you might directly confront the perpetrator, but again, remember that sometimes that may not be necessary depending on how the person receiving the microaggression wants to address the situation. And so oftentimes delay is a valid tactic too, is to check on the target after the fact, check on the person after the fact, and ask them, I noticed this interaction, how are you feeling? Is there something you want me to do or to address this issue? And let the person take charge and tell you how they want the situation addressed, right? So keep these aspects in mind when not only witnessing a potential microaggression, but also those aspects of relating that really help us understand how to really bridge that gap between the intent of our statements and the impact that it makes, and make sure that eventually we're more aware of the statements we make and the impact we have on other people. I do have some additional resources listed here. There are several other places. So OIEC does conduct trainings on bystander intervention. For folks experiencing microaggressions, I invite you to find a safe space where you can articulate your experience and find that support, because it can be so hard to figure out, right, what has happened in the moment. And I find that these groups are really places that helps you unpack those emotions. And then also exploring some asynchronous resources to educate oneself and the whole unit on this topic. And so these are ways in which you can help create an environment where these types of microaggressions and problematic behaviors can be addressed. And then finally, know that when there are systemic issues and incivilities, that there is a reporting and case management system in which you can report this. And so feel empowered to, if it is to a situation where it comes up to having to report these issues, even if, they're one-off incidents and so on, reporting them makes sure that these issues are on record so that they can be addressed in the future. So we do have about 10 minutes. I'm going to pause here just to take questions in the chat, if any. And then I'll invite you all to stay back for a few minutes and we can go through some microaggressive statements as well as discuss, ways in which to address them or ways in which one has experienced or witnessed them. So I'm really here for any further questions, as well as to engage in deeper discussions. And with that, I want to thank everyone for staying here. And again, thank you all for this opportunity. Liz, that's a good question. I think we can stop recording this part because this is the end of the presentation pretty much.